The day everything unraveled began like any other. I woke up in our quiet suburban home to the smell of Sarah's freshly brewed coffee wafting through the kitchen. It was her way of starting the day, her delicate ritual before the chaos of two kids and my demanding business schedule began. 15 years together, two wonderful kids, and a company I'd built from scratch. Our life seemed as close to perfect as it could get. I often thought of Sarah as my anchor. She had this knack for making everything feel stable and warm. I'd come home after long days at the office, drained from meetings and calls, only to find her waiting with a smile, sometimes teasing me about being too much of a workaholic. The kids adored her. I adored her. But lately something felt off. It started as subtle changes. Missed calls, quick dismissals when I asked about her day, and this guarded way she handled her phone. I dismissed it at first, chalking it up to stress or exhaustion. After all, raising kids wasn't easy, especially when I was often away handling business deals. She deserved the benefit of the doubt. Then came a message. It happened when I was looking for her phone to call our son, who'd forgotten his school binder at home. The screen lit up with a notification from an unknown number. "Can't wait to see you again tonight." Counting the hours. For a moment, I felt nothing, as if my brain refused to connect the dots. It couldn't be what it seemed. I glanced around the room, my heart pounding in my chest, and stared at the phone like it was a ticking bomb. She was in the backyard with the kids, laughing as they played tag. The sight of her carefree smile cut me to the core. I told myself there had to be a reasonable explanation, but doubts crept in like shadows I couldn't shake. That night, I couldn't sleep. Sarah lay next to me, her breathing slow and even, but my mind raced. That text wasn't from a telemarketer. Someone was counting down the hours to see her. I needed to know who. The next day, the curiosity became unbearable. I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut, and I couldn't confront Sarah without evidence. I'd seen enough courtroom dramas to know how easily doubt can be turned against you. If I came at her with nothing but suspicion, I'd be the villain in this story. So, I started watching, subtly at first, checking her phone when she wasn't around, keeping an eye on her schedule. She was careful, though. Too careful. The phone was always password protected, and her explanations for her late nights or sudden errands were seamless. Almost rehearsed. I couldn't shake the memory of that text. Its intimacy. Its implication. It was like a splinter lodged in my brain, impossible to dislodge. My wife, the mother of my children, had a secret, and I needed to know what it was. That's when I decided to dig deeper. I hired a private investigator. It felt drastic, like crossing some moral line, but my instincts screamed that something wasn't right. The PI, a gruff, no-nonsense guy named Rick, didn't ask many questions. He didn't need to. He'd handled cases like this before, and I could tell by the way he spoke that he already knew how the story might end. I gave him Sarah's routine, her workplace, even the license plate number of her car. "Give me a week," Rick said. His tone was cold, professional. "You sure you want to know?" I wasn't sure, but I nodded anyway. The days dragged by like molasses. Every interaction with Sarah felt like walking on a knife's edge. She didn't seem any different, still smiling when she dropped the kids off at school, still laughing at my jokes at dinner. And yet, every time she touched her phone or disappeared into another room, my heart clenched. On the fourth day, Rick called. "We need to meet." I drove to a coffee shop downtown, my palms sweating on the steering wheel. When I walked in, Rick was already seated at a corner table, a manila folder sitting untouched in front of him. He gestured for me to sit. "You were right to be suspicious," he said, sliding the folder across the table. I hesitated, my fingers trembling as I opened it. The first photo was grainy, but unmistakable. Sarah, stepping out of a hotel lobby. Alone, but her expression wasn't casual. She looked nervous, glancing over her shoulder, as if making sure no one was watching. The second photo hit harder. Sarah, sitting at a table inside the hotel bar. Across from her was Daniel, my childhood friend, my confidant, and a senior executive at my company. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I flipped through the rest of the photos, each one twisting the knife deeper. Sarah and Daniel walking into a hotel room. The timestamp confirmed it. The night I'd been away on a business trip, clueless. I couldn't process it. Daniel? Of all people? My mind replayed years of memories, moments when Daniel had laughed with us, shared drinks with us, celebrated milestones with us. And all the while, he'd been sleeping with my wife. You okay? Rick's voice snapped me back to the present. I wasn't okay. Not even close. I drove home in a haze, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My world, the life I'd built with Sarah, was crumbling, and I was powerless to stop it. Every memory, every laugh, every kiss felt tainted, poisoned by the knowledge of her betrayal. But I couldn't confront her. Not yet. Not while my emotions were a storm ready to tear everything apart. I needed a plan, a way to make sense of the chaos. Above all, I needed control. That evening, I sat across from Sarah at the dinner table. The photos from Rick burned into my mind. She was her usual self, chatting about the kids' school projects and smiling like she didn't have a care in the world. The mask she wore was flawless, and for a moment, I almost believed it. Almost. The next day, I called an emergency meeting at the office. Daniel was there, of course, his usual confident self. He had no idea that I knew, no inkling that the ground beneath his feet was about to collapse. As I sat in the boardroom, watching him give a presentation on projected earnings, I felt a simmering rage unlike anything I'd ever experienced. How long had he been laughing behind my back? How many lies had he told to keep a secret? I didn't just want answers. I wanted justice. The following week, I took action. My first move was to dig deeper into Daniel's role at the company. As the CFO, he had access to sensitive financial information, and I began to wonder if his betrayal extended beyond my marriage. I requested a comprehensive audit, citing discrepancies in recent reports as the reason. The results were worse than I'd imagined. Daniel had been embezzling funds for years, siphoning money through dummy accounts and shell companies. It was subtle, carefully disguised, but the evidence was damning. The man I'd trusted as both a friend and a colleague was a fraud in every sense of the word. I didn't tell Sarah what I'd discovered. Instead, I focused on gathering more proof. I installed hidden cameras at home, monitoring her movements whenever I wasn't around. At first, the footage was mundane, her doing laundry, helping the kids with homework. But then came the night Daniel visited. I watched from my office, the live feed playing on my laptop. Sarah greeted him at the door, her smile radiant in a way I hadn't seen in years. They kissed, deeply, passionately, before disappearing into the bedroom. My chest tightened, the betrayal cutting deeper than I thought possible. But I didn't look away. I needed to see. I needed to feel the full weight of their treachery. When they emerged an hour later, laughing softly as if sharing a private joke, I made my decision. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming my life. By the time Sarah and Daniel left the house that night, my plan was already in motion. The rage and despair that had consumed me were now replaced by cold, calculated determination. If they wanted to shatter my life, I'd make sure the pieces cut them too. The first step was making sure the evidence couldn't be refuted. I hired a forensic accountant to dig deeper into Daniel's embezzlement. The findings were staggering. Hundreds of thousands funneled into accounts under fake names. He'd not only betrayed me personally, but also jeopardized the company I'd poured my soul into building. Next, I reached out to a private investigator to follow Daniel's movements outside of work. I wanted to know who else he was connected to, who might be complicit in his schemes. The investigator was thorough, providing photos of Daniel meeting with shady associates and transferring envelopes of cash. It was a perfect storm of deceit, and I intended to expose it all. At home, I played the part of the oblivious husband. Sarah had no idea that I knew. She went about her days as if nothing had changed, smiling sweetly at me and kissing me goodnight like we were still the perfect couple. The duality of her life, wife and mother by day, mistress by night, made me sick. Our children, thankfully, were oblivious. I kept our routine as normal as possible, ensuring their lives remained untouched by the chaos swirling beneath the surface. They were my anchor, the reason I didn't let my emotions spiral out of control. The climax of my plan came on the night of the company's anniversary gala, a black tie affair that brought together clients, employees, and their families. It was the perfect setting for a public reckoning, and I intended to make it unforgettable. Sarah and I arrived together, dressed to the nines. She looked stunning, as always, but all I could see was the woman who'd betrayed me. Daniel was already there, mingling with the crowd like he owned the place. Watching him laugh and shake hands made my blood boil, but I kept my composure. As the night progressed, I mingled with guests, biding my time. When the speeches began, I took the stage, thanking everyone for their hard work and dedication. Then, with a calmness I didn't know I possessed, I began to reveal the truth. "Before we continue, there's something I need to address," I said, my voice steady but laced with tension. "Trust is the foundation of any successful organization. Unfortunately, that trust has been broken." The room fell silent as I pulled out the evidence, the financial reports, the photos, the videos. Gasps echoed through the hall as I laid bare Daniel's embezzlement and his betrayal. But I wasn't finished. As if stealing from this company wasn't enough, I continued, locking eyes with him. Daniel also saw fit to betray me on a personal level. For years, he's been having an affair with my wife. The air in the room turned electric. Sarah's face went pale, her eyes wide with shock and horror. Daniel froze, his confident facade crumbling under the weight of my words. Cameras flashed as whispers turned into a cacophony of murmurs and gasps. I stepped down from the stage, walking past them both without a word. I'd made my statement, and there was no taking it back. The fallout was immediate. Daniel was fired on the spot, escorted out by security as he sputtered futile denials. Sarah tried to approach me, tears streaming down her face, but I walked away, leaving her to face the humiliation she'd brought upon herself. The silence at home was deafening. Sarah had tried to speak to me on the drive back from the gala, but I wasn't ready to hear her words. I was still riding the high of finally exposing the truth, but the weight of what lay ahead was beginning to sink in. That night, I slept in the guest room, unable to bear the thought of sharing a bed with her. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the evening in my mind. The look on Daniel's face, the collective gasp of the audience, Sarah's tear-streaked cheeks, it was all burned into my memory. Morning came, and with it, reality. The children were still asleep when Sarah found me in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee I hadn't touched. She looked exhausted, her face pale and puffy from crying. "Michael," she began softly, her voice trembling. "Please let me explain." I set the mug down and stared at her, my face unreadable. "Explain? Explain what, Sarah? That you slept with my best friend? That you lied to me for years? Or that you let him steal from our family? Where exactly would you like to start?" She flinched, her lips quivering as tears filled her eyes. "It wasn't supposed to happen. I didn't plan any of this. But it happened." I interrupted, my voice cold. "It didn't just happen, Sarah. It happened over and over again. You made a choice every single time. Don't stand there and insult me by pretending it was an accident." Her knees buckled, and she collapsed into a chair, sobbing uncontrollably. "I was lonely, Michael," she choked out. "You were always working, always traveling. I felt invisible. And Daniel, he made me feel seen." "See?" I repeated bitterly. "What about me? What about our kids? Did we not see you? Did we not love you enough?" "I never stopped loving you," she cried, reaching for my hand. I pulled away, standing abruptly. "You have a twisted way of showing it," I spat. "Do you even understand what you've done? To me? To our family?" I left her at the table and went outside, needing air, needing space. I couldn't look at her without feeling the betrayal crush me all over again. I walked aimlessly through the neighborhood, my mind racing with questions I didn't want to ask. What would I tell the kids? How could I shield them from the storm brewing around us? Could I ever forgive her? And, more importantly, did I even want to? Over the next few days, I focused on damage control. I informed my lawyers about Daniel's embezzlement, initiating a lawsuit to recover the stolen funds. I also met with a family attorney to discuss the logistics of a divorce. It felt surreal, planning the dismantling of a life I'd spent years building. Sarah tried to reach out to me multiple times, but I kept my distance. I wasn't ready to confront her emotions or mine. The kids, thankfully, were young enough not to notice the tension. For now, they were my only source of comfort. Then came the unexpected twist. Late one night, I received an email from Daniel. It was short and to the point. "Michael, you may have won this round, but don't think this is over. You're not as untouchable as you think." It was a veiled threat, but it ignited something in me, a resolve to see this through to the bitter end. Daniel had taken everything from me, and I wasn't going to let him walk away unscathed. Daniel's email replayed in my mind like a broken record, each word dripping with malice. He wasn't going to slink away quietly, and I knew it. But what he didn't understand was that I was done playing defense. If he wanted to fight, he'd get one. The first step was to tighten my grip on the company. I called an emergency board meeting to address the embezzlement and ensure Daniel's influence was completely eradicated. By the end of the meeting, he was officially blacklisted, his access revoked, and his reputation in the business community irrevocably tarnished. The next step was more personal. I needed to confront Sarah, not for closure, but for clarity. It was late, the kids were asleep, and the house was cloaked in an uneasy quiet. Sarah was sitting in the living room, staring at her phone, probably expecting another message from me that would never come. "Sarah," I said, my voice breaking the silence. She looked up, startled, her face a mixture of hope and dread. "We need to talk," I continued. "And this time, you're going to tell me everything. No half-truths. No excuses. I want the whole story." She nodded, her hands trembling as she set the phone down. "Okay," she whispered. The confession was worse than I'd anticipated. Their affair had started years ago, shortly after our second child was born. Daniel had been a source of comfort during a rough patch in our marriage. She said, a time when I was so consumed with work that I'd left her behind. What began as late-night conversations had escalated into something far more damaging, a physical and emotional entanglement that she claimed to have tried to end multiple times but couldn't. It wasn't just about the affair, she admitted, tears streaming down her face. It was about feeling alive again. But it was wrong, Michael. I know that, and I regret it more than you can imagine. "You regret it now," I said coldly, "because you got caught." She didn't deny it. She just sat there, broken, waiting for me to say something that would either damn her or give her hope. I gave her neither. That night, I didn't sleep. Instead, I drafted my next move. I contacted my lawyer and initiated divorce proceedings, citing infidelity and irreparable damage to the marriage. I also requested full custody of the kids, knowing Sarah's actions could never be fully hidden from them, no matter how hard I tried. Then came the bombshell. As my legal team prepared the case, they uncovered evidence that Daniel hadn't acted alone in his financial schemes. Sarah, whether out of love for him or desperation, had been complicit. She'd signed documents that allowed funds to be diverted, all under the guise of company restructuring. The betrayal was deeper than I'd realized, and it took everything in me not to confront her immediately. Instead, I waited. I needed a public venue for what was to come, a place where their betrayal could be exposed for all to see, and where I could ensure they'd never hurt anyone else again. As the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, I realized that this wasn't just about Sarah and Daniel. It was about the life they'd stolen from me, the years of deception, and the trust they'd shattered. The time had come to lay everything bare. The opportunity presented itself during a routine quarterly shareholder meeting. It was a smaller gathering than the anniversary gala, but still significant. A room full of investors, executives, and key players in the company's future. Sarah wouldn't be there, but Daniel wouldn't dare miss it. He needed this platform to salvage what little reputation he thought he had left. I stood at the podium, scanning the room. Daniel was seated near the front, his face a mask of feigned confidence. He didn't know I'd prepared a presentation that would not only bury him, but ensure his name was synonymous with disgrace. When the meeting began, I addressed the usual business matters, my tone professional, almost robotic. Then, just as people began to lose focus, I clicked to the next slide, a spreadsheet showing the trail of embezzlement Daniel had so carefully tried to hide. The room fell silent as I outlined the scheme in meticulous detail, each fraudulent transaction tied back to him. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, locking eyes with him, "what you see here isn't just a breach of trust. It's a crime, and the man responsible is sitting right here." Gasps filled the room as all eyes turned to Daniel. He stammered, trying to defend himself, but I wasn't finished. I clicked to the next slide, a photo of him and Sarah outside the hotel, arm in arm. The betrayal wasn't just financial, it was personal. For those of you wondering about his accomplices, I continued, my voice unwavering. This man didn't act alone. My soon-to-be ex-wife played her part, signing documents that facilitated his theft. Together, they've not only betrayed me, but all of you. The room erupted. Investors demanded answers, and Daniel's carefully constructed facade crumbled before my eyes. Security escorted him out, his protest drowned out by the chaos. When I returned home that evening, Sarah was waiting for me. She must have heard what happened because her face was ashen, her eyes filled with panic. "Michael," she began, her voice shaking. "What did you do?" "I told the truth," I said simply, brushing past her. "Something you should have tried years ago." Her tears came fast and heavy, but I didn't stop to console her. I went upstairs, packed an overnight bag, and left to stay with a friend. I couldn't be in the same house with her anymore. Not after everything. The following week, Daniel was arrested. The evidence against him was irrefutable, and my legal team ensured that Sarah's role was minimized. I didn't do it for her. I did it for the kids. I didn't want them growing up with the stigma of their mother being publicly implicated. But Sarah wasn't off the hook. The divorce was moving forward, and I'd already secured temporary custody of the kids. She begged me for forgiveness, for a chance to make things right. But I couldn't even look at her without feeling the weight of her betrayal. The days following the public exposure were a whirlwind of legal meetings, custody arrangements, and sleepless nights. The fallout from the shareholder meeting had sent shockwaves through the company. I had expected chaos, but what I hadn't expected was Sarah's desperation. One night, as I was tucking the kids in a bed in our temporary apartment, I received a text from her. "Please, Michael, I need to talk to you. Just one last time." I stared at the screen for a long time. Part of me wanted to ignore her, to let her live with the consequences of her actions. But another part, the part that had once loved her deeply, needed closure. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet her the next day. She arrived at the apartment looking fragile, her once radiant confidence replaced by something hollow. I gestured for her to sit at the kitchen table, but I didn't offer her anything to drink. She wasn't a guest. She was a stranger. "I didn't know you had it in you," she said softly, her eyes darting to avoid mine. "To humiliate me like that." "Humiliate you?" I repeated, incredulous. "You think this is about humiliation? This is about accountability, Sarah. Something you and Daniel seem to know nothing about." She flinched but pressed on. "Michael, I made mistakes. I know that. But I'm still the mother of your children. We've built a life together. Doesn't that count for something?" "It did," I said coldly, "until you burned it to the ground." She began to cry, but her tears no longer moved me. "What do you want, Sarah? Forgiveness?" "Because that's not happening. I want my family back," she whispered. I leaned back in my chair, shaking my head. "You didn't think about your family when you were sneaking around with Daniel. You didn't think about your family when you signed those papers. And now you want it all back. It doesn't work like that." The conversation went in circles, her pleas falling on deaf ears. Finally, she reached into her purse and pulled out a letter. "If you won't listen to me now, maybe you'll read this when you're ready." I didn't take it. "There's nothing left to say, Sarah. You made your choices, and now you have to live with them." She left shortly after, her shoulders slumped in defeat. I sat there for a long time, staring at the unopened letter on the table. Against my better judgment, I picked it up and opened it. It was an apology, a long, rambling account of her guilt, her regrets, and her attempts to justify the unjustifiable. But at the very end, one line stood out. "No matter what happens, I'll always love you. I hope, one day, you can find it in your heart to forgive me." I set the letter down and stared out the window. Forgiveness felt like a foreign concept, something reserved for another life. But her words didn't change anything. The damage was done. The divorce finalized a few weeks later. I was awarded full custody of the kids, and the court ordered Sarah to pay restitution for her role in the embezzlement. She moved out of town shortly after, leaving behind a life in ruins. And then, the twist I hadn't seen coming, Daniel left her. Barely a year after the divorce was finalized, he moved on to someone younger, someone unscathed by scandal. Sarah sent me another letter, this time begging for reconciliation. I didn't reply. The months after the divorce were a strange blend of freedom and emptiness. The house felt quieter, even with the kids running around. The echoes of what once was seemed to haunt every corner. At first, I buried myself in work, using the company's recovery as a distraction from the chaos in my personal life. I sold the old house. There was no way I could stay there. Every wall, every room felt tainted. Instead, I found a smaller home on the outskirts of town, a place where the kids and I could start fresh. It wasn't lavish, but it was ours, and I vowed to make it a sanctuary free from the shadows of the past. Despite everything, I struggled with loneliness. I'd lost not only my wife, but my best friend, or at least who I thought he was. Nights were the hardest, lying in bed alone, replaying the betrayal over and over. I try to push it out of my mind, but grief has a way of sneaking in when you least expect it. One evening, as I sorted through old boxes, I stumbled upon a photo album. It was from the early years of my marriage, back when Sarah and I were still deeply in love. The smiles on our faces, the way we looked at each other, it felt like a lifetime ago. I closed the album quickly, unable to bear the weight of those memories. The unexpected came in the form of Laura. She was a young, sharp-eyed lawyer I'd hired during the divorce to handle the custody battle. Laura had been instrumental in securing not only my kids, but also protecting the company from further financial damage. She was tenacious, intelligent, and unflinchingly honest. A breath of fresh air in the suffocating aftermath of deceit. At first, our relationship was strictly professional, but as the months passed, I found myself drawn to her. She had a way of cutting through the noise, of making even the most daunting problems seem manageable. She didn't pity me, and she never pried. She simply showed up, a steady presence when I needed it most. Our first date was unplanned. After a particularly grueling meeting, we ended up at a small cafe, nursing cups of coffee and talking about everything but work. She told me about her dreams of starting her own practice, her love for travel, and her passion for justice. I told her about my kids, my business, and the storm I was trying to navigate. By the end of the evening, I realized I was smiling, genuinely smiling, for the first time in what felt like years. Over time, Laura became more than a friend. She was a reminder that life could move forward, that love wasn't forever tainted by betrayal. When I finally introduced her to the kids, they adored her instantly. She had a natural warmth, a way of making them laugh, even when they were being difficult. For the first time in a long time, I felt hope. A year had passed since the public unraveling of my marriage and the destruction of my friendship with Daniel. In that time, my life had shifted in ways I hadn't thought possible. The weight of betrayal still lingered, but its sting had dulled, replaced by a cautious optimism I hadn't felt in years. Laura and I had grown closer, and our relationship moved at a pace that felt natural. She wasn't trying to fix me, and I wasn't looking for someone to fill the void Sarah had left. We were simply two people finding comfort and connection in each other. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a future that wasn't defined by pain. One afternoon, as I was unpacking boxes in my new home, I found a sealed envelope tucked into the back of a drawer. The handwriting on it was unmistakable. It was from Sarah. I stared at it for a long time, debating whether to open it. Curiosity won out. Inside was a simple letter, handwritten and unpolished. Michael, I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even expect you to read this. But I need you to know that I'm sorry. Not just for the affair, but for every moment I made you feel unseen, unappreciated, or unloved. I lost myself somewhere along the way, and I dragged you down with me. Losing you has been the hardest thing I've ever endured, but I know now that I deserved it. You didn't. You were a good husband, a good father, and I failed you. I hope, someday, you find happiness again. I'll carry the guilt of what I did for the rest of my life, but I'll also carry the memories of the good times. And there were so many good times, Michael. I hope you remember them, too. I folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope, unsure how I felt. It wasn't closure. It would never be, but it was something. A part of me appreciated her honesty, even if it had come too late. The turning point came during a family picnic. Laura had suggested taking the kids to a nearby park, and the day couldn't have been more perfect. The sun was shining, the air was crisp, and the kids ran around laughing, their joy infectious. As I sat on a blanket watching Laura push the kids on the swings, I realized something profound. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living. The betrayal that had defined my past didn't have to define my future. I could choose to let go, to embrace the life that was unfolding in front of me. Months later, Laura and I stood hand in hand as we watched the kids decorate a Christmas tree in our new home. She wasn't replacing Sarah. She was becoming a part of something new, something better. For the first time in years, I felt whole. Sarah had faded into the background of my life, her presence reduced to occasional updates about the kids. Daniel, as far as I knew, had disappeared completely, and I was okay with that. I didn't need revenge anymore. I didn't need apologies or explanations. I needed peace, and I'd finally found it. This wasn't the life I'd imagined, but it was a life worth living. And for that, I was grateful. It wasn't the ending I'd expected, but it was the one I needed. Michael's story wasn't one of simple revenge or heartbreak. It was one of resilience, of rebuilding, of finding light in the darkest places. What do you guys think of my story? Share in the comments what you think about the choice I made, and would you do in my situation.